It contained the graves of family members of living Palestinians, including people I know personally. Palestinian and Muslim individuals and organizations had been pointing this out and warning of the consequences from the time the museum project was announced. But, of course, they were ignored all along, until news broke that excavators were actually removing bodies and then hurriedly and improperly trying to dispose of them. What followed is one of the most remarkable and surely one of the most profoundly indicative episodes in the entire conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The project leaders refused to consider any alteration in the museum plan following its encounter with a cemetery that had been in active use until 1948 and was, as I said, still being visited by family members of those buried there. Rabbi Heyer, the directors of the Wiesenthal Center in LA, and the museum's backers in Israel were adamant that the project would go ahead as planned on the original site, cemetery or no cemetery. They could not see what all the fuss was about. Palestinians and Muslims, on the other hand, were asking how, in all seriousness, a museum of tolerance, claiming to represent mutual respect and human dignity, could be built on top of a dispossessed people's graveyard, and how such a thing could happen a mere stone's throw from militarily occupied and contested territory, close to by far the most impressive material manifestation of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the oppressive concrete slabs of the separation wall that Israel has built on, in, and around the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which, as you'll see in a moment, the curving titanium-clad slabs of Gary's design for the museum seem to consciously call forth an echo across the old city. The Ma'man Allah cemetery, otherwise known as Mamilla, lies just to the west of the old city of Jerusalem, close to Jaffa Gate. Covering about 50 acres by the early 20th century, it is estimated to have been established in the 7th century and to contain the remains of companions of the Prophet Muhammad as well as warriors of Salah ad-Din's army. Ma'man Allah fell to the Zionist militias that would coalesce into the Israeli army during the uprooting of Palestine in 1948. So did most of the rest of Jerusalem. Multicultural, multi-confessional Palestine was deliberately uprooted in order to clear the space for the creation of a state with an exclusively Jewish identity, to be populated, that is, once most of the Muslim and Christian Palestinians had been driven away, largely by newly arrived European Jewish colonists and settlers. The lands, homes, livestock, furniture, personal effects, clothes, dishes, heirlooms, papers, books, photographs, and all the other personal possessions of the Palestinians driven from their homes and expelled beyond the borders of what would become the State of Israel and blocked from returning after the fighting ended and ever since, were confiscated by the agencies of the Jewish state and eventually transferred to the newly created custodian of absentee property to be distributed to new Jewish owners. What befell the rest of Palestine was also the fate of the cemetery and the other properties of the Waqf, which is the Islamic foundation in Palestine, which are transferred, all of them, to the custodian of absentee property and placed under Israeli control. They remain under state control or under the control of national agencies such as the Jewish National Fund to this day. At first, Israeli authorities and state planners respected the delineations of the cemetery that had been firmly established by the time of Ottoman rule in Palestine. Ma'man Allah's protected status started to erode, however, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a time when the Palestinian citizens of Israel were subject to martial law and were hence ill-equipped to protest. First, a road was paved through the cemetery to connect two neighboring streets. Then, in 1960, a parking lot was built on a small part of the cemetery, a project given the approval of the director of an Israeli-appointed Muslim official who was subsequently arrested and removed from office because of corruption. In the 1980s, the Ministry of Transport established another parking lot on a different section of the cemetery. Further excavation was involved, as it was also during the installation of sewage lines nearby. Dozens of graves were destroyed during all of these excavations, and human remains removed and scattered. Eventually, the custodian of absentee property transferred the cemetery to the Jerusalem municipality. The Palestinian Muslim community and religious institutions protested that transfer, but to no avail. In the same year, city officials established Israel's Independence Park on a large section of the cemetery, a fact that I think requires a little bit of commentary, but it's interesting to think about having an Independence Park on a cemetery. The construction for that project involved the excavation of graves and human remains and the planting of trees and shrubs. Crumbling tombstones can still be seen between the trees of Israel's Independence Park. Today, Independence Park embodies and expresses Israel's uneasy attitude towards the Palestinians, an unstable and indeed explosive mixture of acknowledgement, repression, denial, erasure, and resentment that, despite all the denial and repression, Palestinians still exist and refuse simply to disappear. The sense of incompletion captured in the park also conveys the difference between Israel and other more successful settler colonial projects. In this case, the removal or eradication of the indigenous population to make room for the incoming settler population was not completed successfully. Palestinians comprise 20% of the population of Israel within its pre-67 borders, and about half the total population of the territories over which Israel rules. The sheer persistence of the Palestinian presence represents a threat to Israel's claim to an exclusively Jewish identity. How can a state claim to have one identity when such a large proportion, 50%, of the people over whom it rules have another identity? Even leaving aside the occupied territories, how can Israel claim to be both a Jewish and a democratic state? How can a sense of Jewish homeliness, a sense of home, be secured when there is a competing Palestinian narrative of home attached to the very same land? These are the conundrums to which Zionists from across the political spectrum keep having to return. Even the countless Israeli individuals and organizations like Mahzom Watch or Zochrot or Ta'ayush or others who favor peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians and have done so much to contest the violence imposed by Jewish colonists and the Israeli army on Palestinians in the occupied territories have to reckon with this existential question. How can the Jewish identity of the state be maintained without continuing to override or simply to negate the unyielding Palestinian claim to home inside what is today Israel, to Haifa, to Jaffa, to Akka, and so forth? How, in short, can Zionism, as an exclusive form of nationalism, be reconciled with Palestinian rights, including, above all, the rightful Palestinian claim to land and home inside what is today Israel, to equal rights in the state, and to the right of return to those homes and that land of those who were wrongfully expelled in 1948? Even from the standpoint of Israelis who favor coexistence with the Palestinians, there is no easy answer to those questions. Indeed, there may not be an answer at all. As Ghassan Haj points out, a nationalist discourse of homeliness clearly implies not only an image of nation that is one's own, but also of a self that occupies a privileged relation vis-a-vis that nation, a privileged mode of inhabiting it. This is, Haj adds, evident in the way in which the nationalist treats the other, who is present in the space conceived as the national home, as an object to be managed or removed in order to secure the homely space, while treating the self as spatially empowered to position or remove the other. In the case of Israel, the attempt to secure a sense of Jewish national homeliness involves an endless process of covering over, removing, or managing a stubbornly persistent Palestinian presence. Sometimes this is done physically, for example, as we see in this video clip, by using massive force, riot police, tear gas, and so forth, to break up peaceful protests by the Palestinian minority inside Israel asserting their national identity, which are often received by the Israeli police with, as I said, brutal force, because they're not supposed to have a national identity inside the state. Sometimes it's done by the state officially refusing to recognize the existence of dozens of Palestinian villages inside Israel, which pre-exist the state, and hence denying their population state services and cutting them off from state infrastructure, telephones and water supply, and so forth. And sometimes the Israeli attempt to cover over or deny the Palestinian presence inside Israel is done rhetorically, for example, by denying that Palestinians exist. There is no such thing as a Palestinian, Golda Meir once famously said. Or by trying to wish them away by referring to them by using the generically deracinated term Israeli Arabs rather than the national term Palestinians, which they use themselves. Or by seeking, as is happening today, in a kind of legal corollary to what you're seeing on the screen, to make it illegal for a Palestinian to commemorate the Nakba, or catastrophe of 1948. This extraordinary attempt at historical repression is being packaged in a bill currently making its way through the Israeli parliament with strong government support. Every time Zionists seem to have resolved matters to their satisfaction, whether through repression, denial, or outright violence, Palestinians remind them that they still exist, that they still haven't gone away, that the would-be Jewish state is still not exclusively Jewish, that despite everything, a Jewish sense of homeliness has still not been fully consolidated in what had been, and for Palestinians will always remain, Palestine. This is precisely the source of resentment tapped into by the far right in Israel, most recently by the spectacularly successful leadership of the current foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, and his tellingly named party, Israel Beituna, or Israel is Our Home, which wants to remove the remaining Palestinians from within Israel and, as the Israeli historian Benny Morris puts it, to complete the job of 1948,